The town of Stonebrook, located in the heart of Texas, has always seemed like a calm and serene place. Adults here knew each other by name, children played freely in the streets, and on Sundays the entire community gathered for worship at the local church. One of these inconspicuous but well-known townspeople was Jonathan Miller. At the age of 42, he managed to build a seemingly prosperous life, a small but comfortable house, a stable job at a local auto repair shop, and, of course, marriage to Emily, a woman he met at 25 and with whom he shared almost 20 years of life. Emily was the complete opposite of Jonathan. Cheerful, sociable, and always smiling. She made friends easily and loved to have evenings with loved ones. Everyone in Stonebrook knew her, from the clerks at the supermarket to the neighbors across the street. Her energy and kindness attracted people to her, and many considered her the life of the party. To those around her, she and Jonathan seemed like an ideal couple. He was stable and calm, and she was bright and cheerful. However, behind the closed doors of their home, events have been happening in recent years that no one knew about. Their marriage, which seemed strong at first glance, began to crumble. Jonathan increasingly withdrew into himself, becoming irritable and gloomy. The sparkle that once burned when he looked at Emily disappeared from his eyes. The financial difficulties he faced aggravated his condition. An auto repair shop that once brought in a steady income began to lose customers, and bills that once seemed petty began to pile up, threatening the family's financial well-being. Emily tried to support her husband, but every day she felt that he was moving away more and more. Her attempts to talk about problems, to build a dialogue, were increasingly met with his silence or irritation. At the moments of his breakdowns, she saw in him a person whom she did not recognize, angry, spiteful, desperate. These moments scared her, but she still hoped that these were temporary difficulties that they could overcome together. Stonebrook, despite its calm atmosphere, was not free from gossip. People began to notice that Emily began to appear less often in society, and Jonathan spent more and more time alone. Their friends and neighbors could not help but notice the change in the couple's behavior, but no one asked unnecessary questions. In such cities, personal life remained behind closed doors, and no one was in a hurry to interfere. For Jonathan, every day was a struggle. The struggle with debts, with feelings, with yourself. He no longer saw in Emily the woman with whom he had once dreamed of spending his whole life. In his eyes, she became the source of his problems, a reminder of the hopes and dreams that had been dashed. The internal conflict that was eating away at him grew worse every day, and Jonathan began to realize that their marriage had reached the point of no return. Emily, without losing faith in their future, continued to fight for their relationship, despite the growing alienation. She hoped that she could bring Jonathan back, restore their family, but every day she felt more and more helpless. Anxiety and fear became her constant companions, but she tried not to show it to others, maintaining an outward appearance of well-being. The first step towards tragedy was taken at the moment when Jonathan began to think about how his life would have changed if Emily had not been there. These thoughts, which at first appeared fleetingly, gradually became more and more intrusive. He began to consider them as a possible solution to his problems, as a way out of the abyss into which life had dragged him. And although at first glance there were no signs of trouble, a storm was already boiling inside Jonathan, which would soon erupt, changing the lives of not only him and Emily, but the entire Stonebrook forever. Summer in Stonebrook was unbearably hot. The sun, mercilessly scorching the town from early morning until late evening, seemed to reflect the atmosphere that reigned in the Miller house. The heat seemed to intensify the tension, which gradually turned the cozy home into a trap, where every day felt like stepping on thin ice. Jonathan and Emily's relationship entered a period of silent struggle, where every word and action could become a catalyst for new conflict. Emily was still trying to reach Jonathan. She came up with different ways to return their old feelings, organized joint evenings, prepared his favorite dishes, tried to look attractive, as in the first years of their life together. But her efforts met a wall of indifference and hidden hostility. Jonathan seemed to stop noticing her, perceiving her as a given, or worse, as an obstacle on the way to his personal freedom. One of these evenings, when Emily, dressed in a new dress, prepared dinner and lit the candles, Jonathan returned home later than usual. His face was gloomy, his movements nervous, and he immediately headed to the bedroom, without even sparing his wife a glance. Emily stood in the kitchen watching the candles slowly float away, and felt a sense of hopelessness growing inside her. She tried to talk to him, to ask what happened, but in response she received only a short, "Leave me alone." Such moments began to happen more and more often. Jonathan spent more and more time outside the house, came late, sometimes didn't even spend the night, which only increased Emily's suspicions. She began to think that he had another woman, that someone else had taken her place in his life. These thoughts gnawed at her from the inside, but she could not find the strength to confront him directly. Instead, she quietly suffered, trying to understand where she had made a mistake, and why the person with whom she had lived for so many years had become almost a stranger to her. One day, Jonathan unexpectedly suggested that Emily take out a loan to renovate the house. She was surprised by his unexpected concern for the appearance of the house, which had recently been poorly maintained. However, his idea seemed strange to her. Financial problems were already hanging over them like a cloud, and an additional loan would only worsen their situation. Emily refused, but Jonathan insisted that the renovations were necessary, that it would help lift their spirits and bring joy back to their home. His persistence alarmed her, but she still decided that this was just an attempt to save their relationship. Renovations began, and the house plunged into chaos. Construction workers, noise, dust, all this added stress to their already tense relationship. Jonathan, on the other hand, seemed calmer, his sullenness giving way to a strange detachment. He sat in the backyard for hours watching the work, but his thoughts were elsewhere. It seemed that some kind of plan was being built in his head, which was gradually beginning to take shape into clear actions. Emily, absorbed in worries about home and work, did not notice how Jonathan gradually moved away from her even more. She ceased to be for him a woman with whom he shared joys and sorrows. Now she was just an obstacle on his way to the new beginning that he saw more and more clearly in his imagination. Jonathan thought more and more often about how his life would change if Emily was not around, and these thoughts became more and more attractive to him. One of the key moments was that Jonathan began to drink. Alcohol has become his constant companion these days. At first these were harmless glasses in the evening after work, but soon the amount of drinking began to increase. He drank more and more, hiding from reality, from his problems, from his wife. Alcohol gave him an illusory sense of freedom and peace that he had been looking for so long. In moments of intoxication, he imagined how he would solve all his problems in one fell swoop, how he would get rid of everything that oppressed him. Emily noticed that Jonathan was drinking, but did not attach much importance to it, thinking that it was a temporary phenomenon, that he was just trying to cope with the pressure. But behind this, there was something more hidden. With each new portion of alcohol, Jonathan became more and more decisive in his intentions. And so, on one of these evenings, when Emily tried to talk to him about future plans, that they could go on vacation together, he suddenly burst into a storm of anger. The words she heard shook her to the core. He told her that he was tired of her, that their marriage had become a cage for him from which he dreamed of getting out. His voice trembled with anger, his eyes flashed lightning, and Emily suddenly realized that this man standing in front of her was no longer the Jonathan she knew. For the first time, she felt real fear for her life, although at that time she could not yet imagine what this would lead to. This outburst was a turning point. Something inside Jonathan finally broke, and he no longer saw a way back. His thoughts, previously wavering between fear and determination, now finally rushed into one direction. He realized that the only way to regain control of his life was to get rid of his wife. Every day his plans became more clear, his actions more and more thoughtful. He began to build his strategy without Emily noticing. He no longer tried to talk to her, did not try to return the past. For him, this marriage was already dead, and he was preparing to physically free himself from those shackles that, as it seemed to him, had weighed him down for many years. Emily, despite everything that was happening, continued to hope for the best. She didn't see the whole picture, didn't understand how deeply her husband was immersed in his dark thoughts. Her attempts to regain his attention, to return his love, were in vain. At some point she may have even accepted that their marriage could not be saved, but she did not imagine that her life was hanging by a thread. And Jonathan quietly and methodically prepared to bring his terrible plan into reality. September 2007 brought welcome relief from the summer heat to Stonebrook. The temperature dropped, and the cool evening air began to bring at least some respite to the city's residents. For Jonathan Miller, however, the month meant something more. He wasn't just waiting for autumn, he was preparing for his decisive step, which was supposed to put an end to his torment. His decision ripened slowly, like a poisonous fruit that had to ripen in complete darkness. The day he chose for his plan did not stand out from the rest. An ordinary morning, an ordinary day. Jonathan went to work as usual, and none of his colleagues noticed anything unusual about him. He was calm, collected, as if all his inner chaos had suddenly calmed down, giving way to cold determination. This day was supposed to be the last day of Emily's life, but for those around her it was just another day in a quiet town. Emily spent the day doing household chores and getting ready to meet a friend with whom they planned to spend the evening. She did not notice anything suspicious, although in recent weeks her concern for her husband had intensified. He became even more distant, hardly spoke to her, and responded to all her attempts to get closer with coldness and irritation. But despite this, Emily still hoped that things would get better with time. She could never have imagined that this day would be her last. That evening, Jonathan returned home a little earlier than usual. He looked unusually calm, which immediately caught Emily's eye. She decided that this was a good sign and tried to start a conversation. But he interrupted her, suggesting that they spend the evening together, have dinner, and forget about all the problems. Emily, who had long dreamed of such a moment, agreed, feeling a glimmer of hope. Jonathan seemed to have thought of everything down to the smallest detail. He prepared dinner, chose her favorite wine, creating a semblance of normalcy. There was not an iota of doubt or fear in his actions. Emily was glad for this unexpected attention and tried to relax, let go of her fears. She didn't know that her every step, every action that evening was part of Jonathan's carefully planned scenario. After dinner, he invited her to relax in the bathroom. This was a common ritual for her, and she gladly accepted his offer. Jonathan turned on the water, added her favorite aromatic oils, and left, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. While she was enjoying the warm water, he slowly and silently headed to the garage, where he had prepared in advance everything necessary for his terrible plan. When he returned to the house, Emily was already finishing her water treatments. She didn't notice how he approached her from behind. Everything happened instantly. A sharp blow to the head knocked her unconscious. The bathtub water turned scarlet as Jonathan gently but firmly held her head under the water until her body stopped resisting. In that moment, as her life slipped through his fingers, he felt nothing but relief. Her death was not a crime for him, but liberation, deliverance from the pain and emptiness that tormented him in recent years. He was cold, as if he was doing simple mechanical work, nothing more. All that remained of their life together turned into a few seconds of cruelty, which he committed without hesitation. After everything was finished, Jonathan pulled her body out of the bathroom and carried her into the bedroom. He carefully removed signs of a struggle and made sure it looked like an accident. The water in the bathroom, now clean, was flushed, and the house was put in order. He was sure that his plan was flawless, that the police would consider it a tragic accident. Later that evening, he called the police, reporting that he had found his wife dead in the bathtub. His voice did not tremble. He was calm and reserved, as always. When the police arrived, Jonathan looked devastated but carried himself with dignity, like a man who had just lost a loved one. He told them he returned home to find her unconscious, and that he thought she might have slipped and hit her head. The police began their investigation, but at first glance it really looked like an accident. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, the house was in order, and Jonathan's testimony did not raise suspicions. Emily, it seemed, simply became the victim of a fatal accident, and her death could have gone unpunished if not for one "but." Although Jonathan had thought through everything to the smallest detail, there was one flaw in his plan that he did not even suspect. In the room where he moved Emily's body, on the bedside table stood her watch, which was waterproof and showed the exact time of her death, an hour earlier than Jonathan told the police. This small, seemingly insignificant fact, which could easily have escaped attention, became the very beginning of a chain of events that would soon bring Jonathan to light. However, at this moment, Jonathan was confident that his plan had worked. He knew his life would never be the same, but he felt free. All he could do was play the role of the grieving husband and wait until the investigation confirmed his version of events. Yes, but it was too late. The detective immediately noticed that Jonathan, despite the tragedy, was too collected. In such situations, people are usually either panicked or in shock, but Jonathan was too calm, which aroused suspicion. Carter began examining the scene. The bathroom was almost perfect. Clean water, no signs of struggle or blood. However, he was alarmed by how neatly everything was put away. Too neat, as if someone was trying to make it seem like nothing had happened. His suspicions grew when he noticed minor marks on the floor in the bedroom where Jonathan had moved his wife's body. The marks were faint, but obvious enough to be noticed upon close inspection. These were the trails of water left by Jonathan's wet feet when he pulled Emily out of the bath. Another aspect that piqued the detective's interest was the time of death. Carter asked a forensic expert to determine the exact time of death to compare it with Jonathan's testimony. According to criminologists, Emily died about an hour earlier than Jonathan claimed in his testimony. This discrepancy could have been an accident, but coupled with other small details, it began to add up to a picture that made the detective suspect that something was wrong. The next day, Carter invited Jonathan to the station for questioning. Jonathan agreed without any hesitation, showing his willingness to cooperate. During the interrogation, he behaved calmly and answered questions clearly and confidently. But Detective Carter used his experience to ask questions in a way that would trigger Jonathan's emotional reactions. One of these questions was about their relationship. "How long ago did you notice that there were problems in your marriage?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, but quickly recovered, saying that despite the difficulties, he and Emily tried to maintain a good relationship. Carter was not convinced by this answer. He was able to talk to neighbors who mentioned that in recent months they had increasingly heard quarrels coming from the Miller's house. Some neighbors even noticed that Jonathan was returning home late, and Emily began to be alone more often. All these small details gradually added up to a picture that cast doubt on Jonathan's version of accidental death. One of the key moments in the investigation was that Detective Carter asked for a detailed analysis of calls and messages on Jonathan's phone. The results were not long in coming. Several calls and messages were discovered that Jonathan received and sent in the days leading up to Emily's death. Among them was one particularly suspicious message, sent the day before her death, where Jonathan communicated with an unknown caller and discussed the possibility of a radical solution to problems. At the same time, forensic experts conducted a more detailed examination of the bathroom and found a subtle fingerprint on the edge of the bathtub that did not match Emily's prints. This print matched Jonathan's, providing further evidence that he may have been involved in her death. Carter also met with Emily's friend, who was scheduled to meet her that evening. She said Emily was excited and mentioned several times that she wanted to talk about something important. This increased the detective's suspicions that Emily knew about some of Jonathan's plans or perhaps felt threatened. As the investigation progressed, Carter became increasingly convinced that Emily's death was far from accidental. He began to suspect that Jonathan might have carefully planned her murder in order to get rid of his problems and start a new life. But he lacked convincing evidence to bring charges. Each new fact was like a piece of a mosaic, which gradually formed into a whole picture. One of Carter's colleagues suggested conducting an experiment and recreating the conditions under which, according to Jonathan, the accident occurred. This experiment showed that the likelihood that Emily could accidentally drown in the bathtub without outside intervention was extremely small. This gave Carter new impetus to further investigate. Meanwhile, Jonathan continued to play the role of the grieving husband. He did not miss a single stage of the funeral process, tried to appear heartbroken, but his behavior became more and more like a game. Detective Carter, observing him, saw that his emotional reaction was not what one would expect from a man who had lost his wife under such tragic circumstances. Unraveling the threads of this case, Carter knew that he had a difficult task ahead of him. He knew that in order to convict Jonathan, he needed strong evidence that could be presented in court. But each new step in the investigation convinced him more and more that Jonathan was not just an accidental witness to the tragedy, but a man who consciously and cold-bloodedly brought his sinister plan to life. Jonathan, feeling that the police were becoming increasingly suspicious of him, began to worry. He didn't expect the detectives to be so persistent in their search. Gradually, his confidence began to fade, and he began to make mistakes. For example, during one of the interrogations, he became confused in his testimony when he was asked about the time of his return home that evening. His answers began to contradict themselves, which did not escape Carter's attention. The police continued to collect evidence, and as they accumulated, the picture of what was happening became clearer. Jonathan tried to cover his tracks, but the little details he missed worked against him. Detective Carter soon realized he had enough evidence to arrest Jonathan and charge him with murder. But before doing so, he decided to meet with Jonathan one last time to give him a chance to confess. This meeting was supposed to be the culmination of their game of cat and mouse, where each of them sought to outplay the other. Carter was prepared for any outcome, knowing that if Jonathan confessed, it would be the final step in his downfall. Autumn brought not only coolness to Stonebrook, but also a feeling of impending denouement. News of the upcoming trial of Jonathan Miller quickly spread throughout the city, causing a wave of discussion and gossip among residents. No one could believe that the quiet and inconspicuous Jonathan, whom everyone knew as an exemplary husband and resident, could be involved in such a terrible crime. However, the evidence collected by Detective Carter was sufficient to bring the case to trial. The trial promised to be long and complicated. Prosecutor Michael Henderson, known for his toughness and tenacity, took on the case with every determination to secure a conviction. He understood that the case against Jonathan was built on circumstantial evidence, but his intuition and experience told him that the accused was guilty. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, city residents, and even people who had never met Jonathan and Emily filled every corner waiting for the hearing to begin. Jonathan entered the hall under scrutiny, but despite everyone's attention, he remained unperturbed. His lawyer, Robert Maxwell, an experienced defense attorney with decades of trial experience, was determined to convince the jury that the case against his client was based on guesswork and unsupported assumptions. Prosecutor Henderson began his presentation with a detailed description of the events leading to Emily's tragic death. He presented the jury with a coherent picture of how marital tension, financial difficulties, and hidden hatred led Jonathan to commit murder. Henderson recalled the discrepancies in the time of death, which did not coincide with Jonathan's testimony, and his strange behavior after the discovery of his wife's body. He emphasized that the evidence, although circumstantial, formed a clear picture of a premeditated murder. Then lawyer Maxwell took the floor. His strategy was designed to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. He argued that the accusation was based on assumptions and speculation, and Jonathan, like any other person, experienced shock and confusion after the loss of his wife. Maxwell tried to convince the court that his client was innocent and that Emily's tragic death was just an accident. He focused on the lack of direct evidence and the fact that none of the evidence proved Jonathan's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. The trial lasted for several weeks. Witnesses, experts, friends, and acquaintances testified. Prosecutor Henderson presented Jonathan's phone records, showing that the day before Emily's death, he discussed a radical solution with an unknown caller. This became one of the key points in the case, but the defense insisted that the conversation could concern anything and had nothing to do with the murder. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial was the testimony of Detective Carter, who spoke in detail about the progress of the investigation, about Jonathan's fingerprints found on the edge of the bathtub, and about his strange behavior on the day the body was found. Carter confidently stood his ground, claiming that all the evidence collected indicated that Emily's death was a carefully planned act. He explained that the discrepancy in the time of death and Jonathan's statements could not be an accident, and that the whole picture added up to a story of cold-blooded murder. The defense attempted to challenge the credibility of this evidence, arguing that the police may have been mistaken in their conclusions and Detective Carter may have misinterpreted the data. Maxwell asked the detective tough questions, trying to undermine his confidence and create doubt in the jury. He argued that Jonathan could not have committed such a brutal crime, and that his behavior after the tragedy could be explained by shock and stress. Despite the defense's best efforts, Henderson managed to convince the jury that there could be no accident. He focused on a strange coincidence. Why did Jonathan decide to spend the evening with his wife if their relationship was on the verge of breaking down? Why exactly on this day did he suddenly become a caring husband if he had previously avoided communicating with Emily? The prosecutor argued that this was not a coincidence, but part of an elaborate plan. The legal debate heated up when the prosecutor presented the latest evidence. Fragments of correspondence in which Jonathan mentioned his financial problems and how he wanted to start over again. These messages were another blow to the defense. Henderson insisted that Jonathan saw his wife's death as a way to free himself from debts and problems, making his motives obvious. Finally, it's time for final words. The prosecutor urged the jury to remember all the small but important details that, in his opinion, added up to a whole. He talked about how Jonathan may seem like a good person, but these are the people who often hide their true intentions under the guise of integrity. He recalled that Emily was the victim of a cold and calculated murder and called on the jury to reach a fair verdict. Maxwell, in turn, again tried to convince the jury that there was no conclusive evidence against his client. He said many aspects of the case could have been misinterpreted, that emotions should not obscure the truth, and that Jonathan deserved an acquittal. He encouraged them to use the doubt and give Jonathan a chance at justice. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere was tense as a string, and everyone held their breath waiting for the verdict. Jonathan sat calmly, but his hands were clenched into fists, betraying his internal tension. "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder," the jury foreman said. The words sounded like a lightning strike, breaking the silence in the hall. Jonathan finally lost his cool. His face became ashen and his hands trembled. He understood that this was the end. All his efforts to hide the truth, all his attempts to convince others of his innocence collapsed in one moment. The fate was sealed. Prosecutor Henderson allowed himself a faint smile. He knew he had done everything he could to get justice for Emily. Carter, watching, felt satisfied that his long weeks of investigation had led to this moment. The sentence was harsh, life imprisonment without parole. Jonathan Miller, once a respected resident of Stonebrook, became forever an outcast from society, a criminal whose cruelty shocked everyone who knew him. Now he had to spend the rest of his life in prison, reflecting on the mistakes that led to his downfall. The trial is over, but for Stonebrook residents, the case will live in the memory for a long time. This tragedy showed that even the quietest and most seemingly prosperous families can hide dark secrets that can destroy lives. And although justice has triumphed, the city will never be the same. After the verdict was announced, the silence in the courtroom seemed almost unbearable. Viewers, friends, acquaintances, and even those who had never personally known Emily and Jonathan were gripped by a mixture of relief and shock. The realization that a man they knew and perhaps even respected was a cold-blooded killer left deep wounds in their hearts. Jonathan Miller, now a convicted felon, was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He no longer tried to maintain external calm. His face showed only depression and the realization that his life was over at this stage. A life sentence meant he faced an eternity in prison, where every day would remind him of what he had done. His life, once full of ordinary worries and aspirations, turned into an endless series of joyless days behind prison bars. However, the story did not end there. It took a long time for Stonebrook to recover from this tragedy. People tried to comprehend how this could happen in their quiet town. Many began to doubt their surroundings, what they knew about their friends and loved ones. This event was a painful reminder that the true essence of a person is sometimes impossible to recognize, even if he has lived next to you for years. Emily's family, upon learning of the verdict, experienced conflicting feelings. On the one hand, they were grateful that justice had prevailed, but on the other, the realization that she had passed away in such a cruel way was unbearable. They couldn't forgive Jonathan for what he had done, and couldn't come to terms with the idea that their daughter would never come back. They left the city shortly after the trial, not wanting to stay in a place where everything reminded them of their lost daughter. Prosecutor Michael Henderson, despite the successful outcome of the case, felt bitter that a life had been ruined. He knew he had gotten justice, but it couldn't bring Emily back. He spent the evenings after the trial alone, wondering how many more such stories were hidden behind the walls of quiet houses across the country. The Jonathan Miller case was one of those cases that stays with you forever, reminding you of how fragile human life can be and how easy it is to destroy. Detective James Carter, who had been on the case since the beginning, felt both satisfied and tired. His intuition was right, but the price for it was too high. He knew that justice had been achieved, but the knowledge that he had witnessed such darkness left a deep mark on him. After the trial, he took a vacation to rest from thoughts of how thin the line between man and beast within him was. The town of Stonebrook, which seemed like an ideal place for a quiet life, was no longer that way. Several years have passed, but Jonathan Miller's story has become one of those told in a low voice, as if afraid to evoke the ghosts of the past. New residents who moved to Stonebrook sometimes heard about this case, but for them it was only part of the history of the city, something distant and not entirely real. For those who knew Jonathan and Emily personally, it remained a scar that will never heal. Years later, in one of the local cafes, sitting over a cup of coffee, two old friends recalled this story. They talked about how their lives changed after those events, how they began to value their loved ones, and how this incident made them look at the world around them differently. Some said that Jonathan was a monster, others that he was just a man broken by life, but they all agreed on one thing. This incident reminded them that even in the quietest and most peaceful corners, real tragedy can be hidden. Life in Stonebrook gradually returned to normal. But this story remained in the memory of the city. Emily Miller, a young woman whose life was brutally cut short, has become a symbol of how dangerous repressed feelings and hidden emotions can be. Her name was now mentioned with respect, and flowers from those who knew and loved her could often be seen at the site of her grave. Thus ended the story of Jonathan and Emily Miller. It was a lesson for everyone, a lesson about how important it is to see people for who they really are, and how important it is not to turn a blind eye to the dark sides that may lurk inside each of us.